Cutting well. A rather controversial topic, especially for those of us who really like HEMA due to the martial part and the historical part. I got into HEMA because I like history and I like martial arts. So it can be a controversy and a bit of a complex conversation because really, the way I see it, cutting really depends on the tool you're using. Let me explain. This sword, wooden sword, crappy wooden sword I made for myself since I do not have the money to get a master. Not yet. Anyways, but this sword has a point of balance that's very, very far away from the guard, from the hand. And if this were to be steel, yeah, this would be able to cut quite effectively. Even a small motion from here to here, maybe dropping the... This in itself would be able to cut quite well. So my opponent parries and I just drop the weight with the weight of the sword, with the point of balance of the sword, I'm sorry. Yeah, this is going to be able to cut enough to, daze my opponent so I can go for the finishing blow. But this sword here is lighter than this sword here. The overall weight of this sword here is larger than of this one. And if we push this to an extreme, if I were to try and lop off of hand, we can have something like, I don't know, this here. It's supposed to be a rapier, but I don't like cup hilts, and this came with a cup hilt, and I want to change everything. But imagine this was, like a proper rapier. This here is much heavier than this. But this is going to be a much better cutter than this. And why is this? This is due to a point of balance. And why all this discussion about weight and point of balance? Well, because this determines how we cut with a sword. Because swords are not lightsabers, especially the lighter they get. If we see Charles Roloff or Captain George Sinclair, we see cuts that are made with very little motion. We see Charles Roloff advising to do only this. Not a lot of movement. And with the swords, but these swords here are infantry officer swords. And generally, from the very early 18th century, perhaps even the 17th century, mid-17th, late 17th century, all the way to even to the First World War, infantry officer swords, even if the designation infantry officer didn't exist, but these sorts of swords used by footmen, like leaders of men who use their sword on a battlefield, with the exception of the small sword, of course. But these sorts of swords, mortuary hilts, spadroons, broadswords, broadswords used on foot, not the cavalry broadswords with a big blades. But a cut and thrust sword was generally around 800 to 750 grams, perhaps 650. And these swords, with these sort of medium point of balance, would be able to cut quite effectively with not a lot of motion. The point of balance of these swords can vary, but generally the farther the point of balance it is, the less movement you need to cut with. And if we go again to the extreme version of this, you end up in the Middle Ages with something like a Langas Mesa that doesn't need a lot to do damage. Yeah, generally we think of the Middle Ages as doing big movements in order to incapacitate, the Zorro. We see the Becker. We see a lot of different sorts of cuts that are very wide. But in truth, you really do not need a lot of movement to cause a lot of damage. The reason these wide cuts were used was because we don't have a lot of hand protection, and we use footwork to nullify that, working in diagonal lines, at least in the German system. But there are several times in which Hansler Kuschner, and several other manuals, just advise dropping the blade, the false edge, over your opponent's head and bonking them like that. And that being sufficient to daze them. That would not be the case with something like this. You say this actually has a nice point balance. It doesn't. If I tried to bonk someone in the head with this, it doesn't have the weight. So we are going to have to cut in a very different manner with this than with this. With this, we need tip speed. With a rapier, we are going to need tip speed. We're going to use this sort of as a whip. So let's say I constrain the cuarta, I thrust. Someone displaces that, they're coming, blade's coming here, do this, and cut. I'm using this to gather all the tip speed I can. And then I'm delivering a very powerful cut. That works because although this blade is not very heavy, and imagine this is a proper rapier, the point of balance may not be very, very far away from the hilt. We have a lot of leverage, a lot of length to develop speed. And you're not going to cut with the tip, you're going to cut with this part. If you cut with the tip, you're going to rip out clothing, but you're not going to rip out flesh. It's probably just going to nick the opponent. In an adrenaline-filled situation, small nicks are really not going to do much. Your opponent might not even notice if they get cut, even if it's a substantial one. If it's in the shoulder, in the torso, they might not even notice it. So best to ensure that the cut is done properly, hitting with the right part of the blade. And this also applies to the infamous spadroon in dueling saber. The spadroon is indeed a complex topic since they varied a lot. The spadroon in the late 18th century, early 19th century, the standard regulations were quite loose. So people could do whatever they want. They could make a spadroon something like a small sword, or they could just put a big, beefy broadsword blade on the spadroon. Didn't really matter. But as the regulations got tighter, we saw the emergence of swords that are very practical for combat and others that are not. Or others that are very practical for combat but not for cutting. For example, if we have something like the 1898 infantry officer's saber, it usually weighs around 700 to 800 grams, but with the point of balance that's here, it is no longer really advisable to use these very small movements, the way Charles Rowlatt or Captain G. Sinclair instruct us to use with our sabers. The point of balance means that the blade no longer has a lot of momentum, which is great for a thrusting sword, which that sword may very much is. In fact, Alison Wynne, in his manual, Broadsword and Saber, not Broadsword and Single Stick, states that with an infantry officer, the point will always be preferred. And this is an Englishman that we're dealing with. So a lot of the very late dueling sabers, I put dueling sabers in quotations because it wasn't really a sword, it was a method. There's very little evidence for sharp dueling sabers. They're mostly just a method. And that method does describe using the Mulinate to generate power. You need the tip speed with these lighter, more backwards balanced blades. But again, just because a blade is light doesn't mean it's not a good cutter. We need to take into consideration the point of balance. If I were to transfer the mass of this stick directly into a blade, this would be a really nice cutter. Even with its low weight. If I simply, bam, come here with a cut to, good edge alignment, and let's say this is a blade, this is going to lop someone's hand off. Or if not, at least give them a very, very deep cut that's kind of got cut all the way to the bone and, disable the arm or the hand. It's going to be able to cut through clothing. It's going to be able to penetrate clothing because a point of balance allows the weight of this weapon. Let's say this was a blade. If a blade was made with these dimensions, the point of balance would allow it to squish the clothing, and the edge only needs to cut. The edge no longer has to deal with, loose clothing. Which is why we have so many accounts of sabers and swords and all sorts of weapons, edged weapons, not making it through clothing. Which is that, because clothing is actually quite difficult to cut with, especially with more backwards balanced blades. You need the tip speed to get through clothing. So when we cut, whether it be with a saber, when we cut with a mace, or when we cut even with a knife, let's say we're doing knife combat, we're here and I'm doing this, we always need to consider what tool are we using. With something like this, from here to here, I'm going to damage a lot. But with something, say, like this has almost the same length, but not a lot of mass. And also considering the handle broke. Well, this doesn't have a lot of mass. This is not going to cut it. You need that bit more oomph in that blow. So we really need to take into consideration when we're doing our sparring, our drills, what are we using and how would it work against clothing? The human body itself is delicate, but usually in the context that we are using swords, the temperature was much lower, the clothing much thicker, more difficult to cut, which is why throughout history, even infantry officers' sabers, even regular pikemen preferred a hefty, beefy, forward-weighted sword. Whether it be an infantryman's hanger, a British grenadier's hanger, or the French briquet, or the cabbage chopper. Generally, a sword that's more forward-weighted is going to be better for the cut. And in the context in which these weapons were made, with much colder weather, with much thicker clothing, we're gonna have to be using very specialized blades, either for the cut or the thrust. This is also why the small sword gained prudence. I don't have a epee or a foil or a practice small sword to show, so I'm gonna use this, for example. But the reason why the small sword was very, very thick was because they needed to get through the clothing. It is the same exact thing with a cut. We cannot forget the historical context in which these tools were made for. Everything depends on the context. You cannot cut with a spadroon or a dueling saber the same way you can cut with a broadsword, and vice versa. If you try to do these moulinets with a broadsword, I can sort of do it with this, but with a broadsword, with an actual, Scottish basket-hilted broadsword, this will be difficult. Not to mention that cutting with a sword also depends on the level of hand protection. If I have my hand exposed, I'm not going to be using moulinets. I'm not going to be having my sword in front. I'm going to be having it back, preparing for something. I'm going to be using footwork differently. The reason why these swords were designed the way they were was because they existed in a context. So next time you're doing your drills or doing sparring, consider that. What sword are you using it? And what context was it made for?